Hey, welcome to Strategy Shorts Episode 4, The Dark Side of 2-Drops. So another common piece of advice that is given on the regular to Duelyst players young and old is that you should put 6 to 9 2-drops in your deck. The reason behind this, in case you're unaware, is because you need 2-drops in order to get on the board early. Duelyst is a very tempo-based game. Between the mana tiles, overall board position, and the aggressive nature of a lot of the decks, it really helps if you can take ground early, get your stuff on the table, and start trading with your opponent's creatures as early as possible, or pushing face damage. Which means that if you don't play a minion on the first turn, you can fall behind very quickly. Most decks can play a decent number of 2-drops and 3-drops combined, but 2-drops specifically are the only ones that help you out when you're going first. And so in order to ensure, at least to a high probability, that you have a turn 1 play going first, people generally advocate that you should put between 6 and 9, ideally trending towards the high end of that range, cards that you're happy to play on the first turn that cost 2 mana in your deck. So, why is this good? Well, we went over the rough reasoning behind the advice, but just to properly spell it out, playing 2-drops is great because when you play something on turn 1, you can contest mana tiles more easily, which means you can jump up the mana curve to play a 4-drop on turn 2, 4-drops being a lot stronger than 3-drops in most cases. It allows you to make early trades. It may absorb enemy removal, forcing them to commit less to the board on their first turn. And it gives you flexibility. Like if your opponent plays something in the middle of the board and you have something in play, right? You played a 2-drop, then you can move up with your general and your creature and attack. You can buff your creature and attack. You can take a mana tile and play something else, etc. If you didn't play a creature on turn 1, you can't do a lot, right? You can't contest their 3-4 or whatever particularly effectively with just your general without having to spend more mana into it, meaning you're still behind and your opponent can play something new, some new threat to keep up on top of you. All of that is bad, and all of that is solved by just playing a 2-drop. Job done. The problem with having 2-drops in your deck is that sometimes you draw them after turn 1, and it turns out that the vast majority of 2-drops are just really bad as cards in the mid to late game. The reason behind this is typically they have very small bodies. There are some 2-drops that will have an effect very late in the game, especially in particular decks. Like if Cryptographer, for instance, can be very powerful later on. Primus Fist has some synergistic applications. Shiro is really good with Raver. But in general, most 2-drops have a very low impact on the board. And if you're playing a 2-drop instead of like a 4-drop or a 6-drop later on, you're going to really fall behind. A lot of the time, your deck will curve out really nicely. You'll go 2, 3, 4, 5 with removal as appropriate. This is all going great, and then at some point you'll look down at your hand and you've just got 3 2-drops and some situational removal spell that you can't use right now. And you're just kind of a bit screwed. You do what you can, you play out 2 of them, whatever, and then your opponent just drops a Macanta Warbeast, clears them all, and you lose. Or something. And having these small, low-impact cards in your deck means that you're exposed, you're susceptible to having these weak turns where all you can play is 1/4s. So, although being able to get on board early is very good, by having a lot of 2-drops in your deck, but you're punished a little bit by what happens later on, where once you've gotten on the board and you've survived and you've stabilized, you've kept up with your opponent, now what? Now you need to overpower them with card advantage, or now you need to find your haymakers, and instead you're drawing as a heralds. Like, not amazing, right? So, what can you do about this? Obviously, Duelyst decks do function despite running 2-drops, and it turns out there are a lot of different ways that you can work around this limitation within the game. So I'm just going to go through a few of the different options. I've got 6 decks from my collection that I've queued up at the top of my collection manager here, and I'll just quickly flick through each one and discuss how it works with or against this problem. So the top one is Keep of Earth. This is probably the most obvious one. If you know me from earlier this year, whenever it was, I played a bunch of tournaments with this deck. This deck plays no 2-mana creatures and only one 3-mana creature, which right now is Murkblood Devourer, but you know, yesterday it was Ragebinder or whatever. Why is this bad? Well, going first, you usually can't do anything on turn 1. Sometimes you have Flash Reincarnation into like a Sunsteel Defender, which obviously has Force Field, so the Flash Reincarnation damage doesn't affect it too much. Sometimes you throw an Iridium Scale, just because you can get it out of your hand this way, and it might force your opponent to play differently. But usually you just do nothing. And if you don't have something to do next turn, you might end up overdrawing and fizzling a card, which is quite bad. Now, you obviously have Natural Selection and Murkblood as well, so that isn't so likely, but it's a risk. How do you make up for this tempo loss? Because you're doing nothing, and then they're playing like a Silverguard Knight or something, and you're, how do you come back from that? Well, it's not called Keep of Arth for nothing. We have Keeper of the Veil, which resurrects a destroyed minion, and we get to take advantage of our high clunky curve by only playing minions that are really good to bring back with Keeper of the Veil. This also means that the same minions tend to be very high in tempo themselves. They're high impact cards. We've got Thunderhorn, Sunsteel Defender. Further up, we've got Lava Slasher, if the mouse would work. Lava Slasher, Mechanta Warbeast, Grove Lion. Like, these cards are all really good to bring back, which means that your Keeper provides an enormous tempo swing and value on top of the tempo swing and value you got off the big minion in the first place. And because you're developing two things with Keeper, sometimes at a discount, sometimes it's a Mechanta and it gets to attack again and just deploy an AoE, you can make up for the early lost tempo by having a giant swing turn on like turn 4-ish. This is my Flawless Reflection Ghost Seraphim combo list. This is a pretty common list right now. This is my own particular version that I'm sort of in the middle of tinkering with, but it's half what I originally brewed when the set came out and half net deck. The plan is usually the same. You have Ghost Seraphim to make, it's a giant creature that makes your spells cost 0. Flawless Reflection, you cast this on Ghost Seraphim, everything around it becomes an 8/9, and you make sure that it's surrounded by cheap walls. You make a bunch of 8/9s, you kill your opponent. This deck plays basically no real 2-drops apart from Crystal Wisp. So it has a lot of cards that cost 2 mana, but they're all removal spells. Mana Death Grip, Aspect of Shimzar, Chromatic Cold, Frigid Corona is kind of a removal spell. Gravity Well is a combo piece. Hearth Sister, you can play this on turn 1, but you don't usually want to. So, like, why isn't this a problem? Well, if you have to Frigid Corona them on turn 1, that's actually fine. Your opponent is stuck at the other end of the board, which gives you a bit of breathing room, which makes up for the fact that you didn't commit anything to the board. You still get to take some ground, essentially. Crystal Wisp is obviously really good. Like, whether or not they kill it, you still basically get the mana tile. Things like Gravity Well, early on you can just spread it across the board to frustrate and interfere with your opponent, and then you can make up for this by drawing cards. Worst comes to worst, the deck has a number of quite bomby top-end cards that are the main combo pieces, and things like Grandmaster Embler. These cards all vaguely work together, but are also, for the most part, quite strong on their own. And so if you run low on cards, there's still some comeback mechanics built into the deck. But primarily you can just reload with Spelljammer and cycling with Frigid Corona. My previous version of this deck actually had more card draw for this reason. I used to play Sojourners and the full set of Spelljammer, just to make sure I found the combo more consistently. I'm tinkering with a sort of in-between version at the moment. What's next? 8 Gates River. This is a very popular deck right now. This deck basically plays like a burn deck with a bit of control mixed in. Your early turns are usually spent casting removal spells, like Katatsu and Twin Strike. And you accumulate a critical mass of spells in hand that can deal damage to the opponent's face. 8 Gates, Phoenix Fire, the Boulder Hurl off Rocket Up Terror, and even just good old face attacks with an artifact equipped. And then you burst your opponent down in the mid-game before they can overwhelm you. This deck plays basically no 2-drops apart from Cryptographer. Cryptographer is quite good as a turn 1 play because River's Bloodborne spell is awesome, and being able to deploy a Heartseeker when you're far away from the opponent is really nice. But in general, this deck is quite happy to not commit to the board on turn 1 because of specifically Twin Strike. If your opponent gets ahead on board, and you've got Crescent Spear plus Twin Strike, you can just kill both their creatures, draw an extra card, all is well in the world. You also have you have these creatures that you can play on turn 2 that are expendable, but quite good at trading. Rockodoptera basically cycles. Lantern Fox obviously generates Phoenix Fires when your opponent attacks it. Battle Pando pings them when they attack it. So your opponent can run over them with their board presence, but that still furthers your game plan or helps blunt their onslaught a little bit more than a random other creature would. And then once you get to about turn 5 or 6, your opponent's usually further ahead on board than you, but you have Eternity Painter and Zendo if you need to buy a couple of turns, and then you just kill them with multiple Phoenix Fires or a Spiral. So this deck doesn't worry too much about being behind on board because it has very efficient removal options that also help cycle through to find combo pieces. Basically fueled by Crescent Spear, you can use Ghost Lightning, Gotatsu, and Twin Strike extremely efficiently to clear your opponent's board off at a minimum cost, making up for the tempo disadvantage of not playing minions, or particularly significantly large minions. Geizuzu, this is an aggro deck. This is basically the other extreme, where you make a deck that just wants 2-drops, and this deck plays like 10 or something. More than that. Just quickly counting. 15. I make it 15. And that's because you don't mind about emptying your hand. You don't mind if all your cards are bad. You're going to kill your opponent very quickly. So if the game never goes beyond turn 5 or 6 in a majority of cases, that is absolutely fine. Right? You can do the last 2 points of damage with the last card in your hand. You still won the game. You're not really interested in trading resources basically ever. So it's perfectly fine for you to top deck cheap chaff, because the fact that you can play multiple threats to the board that can deal face damage and help finish off your opponent in one turn is better than having something more powerful that might, say, trade for a removal spell or easily be avoided. You just want to go face. So in this deck, the fact that your cards lose value in the long game, not a problem. That is just not the point. All you want to do is kill them quickly. And so running lots of 2-drops becomes an advantage, not a disadvantage. Hateful Argent, this is a control deck. And this deck basically runs the bare minimum of 2-drops that I felt I could get away with, while still being able to make some sort of tempo play. Excuse me. The deck is not particularly high curved. It has a lot of 4-drops and not much else. Just because that's where a lot of the key tools that the deck happens to want are. So being able to ramp them out is pretty handy. But at the same time, it can live perfectly well with not having played something on the first turn, because it has Scintilla and Silver God Knight, and Silver God Knight in particular is very large and very sticky. It's a really high tempo card. So if you do nothing into Silver God, it's still mostly alright. The reason it doesn't play things like Windblade Adept or Azaret Lion, those are just not part of the plan. I'm not looking to push early face damage. I'm not looking to try and surround my opponent, out-tempo them. I'm looking to out-grind them with Trinity Oath, with healing, and with things like Night Watcher to frustrate my opponent's best cards. So these 2-drops are the ones that heal me, right? The deck needs healing. It's a slow deck. It goes for the long game. And it is helpful to have 2-drops. They have some use later on with things like Holy Immolation. More importantly, though, one of the biggest ways to make up for playing 2-drops in your mid-range deck or your control deck is by playing powerful card draw. And being a Lionheart deck, this deck has access to Trinity Oath. So I can make up for the fact that, I played 2 bad cards in one turn, or I played a 1/4 just to get Holy Immolation on it, by casting Trinity Oath and refilling my hand, recouping that card disadvantage. Especially against an opponent that doesn't have this capability and has 2-drops of their own, you're going to end up ahead. And finally, my Alabaster Titan deck. This is, again, not massively different from a typical Titan deck. It's just my current exact build. This has 7 2-drops, because although the deck is quite mid-rangey, it's relatively slow. You're looking to get to 7 mana and cast your win condition. It doesn't have any spells. It doesn't have that much ability to catch up from behind on board, especially if you don't draw Sunset Paragon, which means that you do need to get ahead to some extent. And you also need healing because people are going to be attacking you, rushing you down. So we're playing the set of Azure Heralds and a Healing Mystic for the healing part, and we're playing Azuret Lion as the most flexible, powerful, high-tempo turn 1 play. The Lions are still pretty bad. Like, later in the game, it's surprisingly awkward to set up a 2-3 to not die. Like, I usually have to end up maneuvering in such a way where, I'm retreating slightly and putting the Azuret Lion behind me just to make sure that it doesn't die for free to my opponent's general or some decent sized 4-drop. And even then, they usually find some other way of killing it or punishing it with an AoE, a Mercantor or something. So the card is something of a weak point in that it doesn't provide value when it comes down. But it has high enough upside, and it's something that I sort of begrudgingly need enough that I'm playing it. I'm not playing Windblade Adept because that isn't quite as good as Azuret Lion. And I want to minimize how many of those cards I have in my deck, because without Trinity Oath, it's still a weak point. I have Solarius as a card draw source, which does help a bit. And similar to the Vanna deck, I have this high curve of bombs. So like, even if I'm top decking, I have things that I can top deck into that are worth an entire turn of mana and then some. Like, if I run out of cards but then I rip a Titan, I might win anyway. Which means that it's not as bad to have to play these cards. But, being forced to play an Azuret Lion on like turn 5 is just the worst thing ever. So that wraps up that look through my example decks, at least. Just to summarize the points we came across over the course of time. 2-drops are powerful for providing tempo early on, something of a necessary evil for a lot of decks that want to fight for the board early. However, there are ways to avoid having to play them, which is good, because when you draw them later on, they tend to be very unimpactful, and games can be lost because you drew your 2-drops instead of other cards in the mid to late game. To make up for this, you can play minimal 2-drops that provide you other utility that you need anyway, like, for instance, healing 2-drops in a control deck. Things like Phantasm in your Abyssian decks, which are like combo pieces. Make up for it by playing high-tempo minions later on. Silver God Knight came up, Keeper of the Veil came up. These plays are powerful enough to make up for the fact that you missed a turn. Play bomby win conditions, so that if you run low on cards, you still have some kind of 7-drop that you can top deck into and win with it. Play heavy-duty card draw spells to make up for having a low-curve deck, or lower curved cards in your high-curve deck. And finally, just play an aggro deck, go face, and take advantage of the fact that you want your cheap rubbish cards to flood on the board in number, because you're not looking to accumulate resources over the course of a long game. You're just looking to kill your opponent. So that about wraps this up. I hope it was useful and illuminating. Something of a downside of having 2-drops be so ubiquitous is that a lot of decks actually don't want them. So I've spent some time thinking about how you can get around this and tweaking my decks, and it's really helped. Like, they end up performing a lot better when I take into account that I had these like 6 or so dud cards in my deck as the game goes on. I'm just trying to get as much value out of that slot as possible, playing things like Azure Herald, one of the better 2-drops to draw later on, because it does keep you alive against burn spells and burst. Things like Primus Fist, although the card is quite awkward, you can top deck it and buff something just to get in damage. That can be useful. So, if you have to play a 2-drop, it can be an alternative. Things like that. So I hope this helps. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.